Thank you very much. I'm really honoured and fairly intimidated to be here, so I'll give it my best shot. I particularly want to thank Dave, my carbon mentor. It's a bit like I'm a little loaves to your fishes, Dave. I learned so much, but also my husband, Mark, who's sitting over there, and Adi, and everyone who I've met, particularly in the last three years probably in Western Australia, who cares enough to inform themselves and to do something. So thank you. It's a privilege to be here. And a shout out to Sam Pullman, who might not be here, he might be home, but he helped us pull the presentation together. So here we go. So I think food is probably one of the most emotive things in our lives. You know, if you close your eyes, you can probably remember the smell or the taste of the food from when you were a kid that really bound you to your family. Food binds us to the earth. It's how we connect with each other. It's you know, we express our cultural norms with food, and it's about a quarter of the solution for how we're going to, I hope, limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. And I think in Western Australia, it's time for a new dialogue about food. So, you know, the last few weeks, we've had the flood over the railway line in South Australia. We don't have food security. It's quite clear with the major supermarket chains. We're big exporters of food. We're incredibly efficient at exporting. We're proud of it. We're scientific about that. But we've got a lot of people who are hungrier through COVID, so we have food insecurity. So if you put all of that into the mix, I think it's time for a rethink. So here goes. Working? Where am I pointing next? Okay. Bottom one? Should be. Glad it's not me. Yeah. Never had this first time. Done? Right, working?
Yeah, it should be working. So it's just that one, just that.
Yeah. Okay, so there is a global crisis. I think we're all here because we accept that. Food production, I said a quarter, it's a third, depending on how you measure it on the scopes. Food production is responsible for most of our biodiversity loss. We're actually running out of land. And we've got 7.8 billion people now, but in 28 years, we'll have around 10 billion. So we have to get to net zero in 28 years and feed 2 billion more people more equitably. 800 million people are overweight. So what does that say about our food distribution and our food consumption? And then another 800 million or so don't have enough food, and that's wrong. That's not a just transition. And my husband would say I'm pretty guilty of this. You know, a lot of the food that we consume is wasted. So it really is 2 minutes to planetary midnight, and I have a sense of urgency, a real personal sense of urgency as a mum and a professional and someone who can influence out and about. And I don't shy away from the sense of urgency. I try not to harangue people, but if people are interested in talking about food and agriculture, then I'm in there to have a chat. I think probably you all are pretty familiar about the kinds of gases and their global warming potential and how long they stay in the atmosphere. But for agriculture, the big ones are methane and nitrous oxide. So methane from enteric emissions from cattle and sheep, nitrous oxide from fertiliser. And it's quite frightening to think that, I think, where's 80? Nitrous oxide's about 110 years in the atmosphere, right? So pretty...
Yeah, but it's warming potential.
Yeah.
Hundreds.
Yeah. So, you know, everything we've lost from nitrogen applications that weren't used efficiently since my dad was farming down in Tamble up in the early 60s is still floating around somewhere. And this is from the, Dave will speak to this actually, but it's from the Potsdam Centre.
Stockholm.
Say it again.
Stockholm Resilience Centre.
Stockholm
Sweden.
Resilience Centre. So this is,
Same,
what's his name?
Rochester.
Yeah, Jan Rockstrom, Planetary Boundaries. And it's frightening when I consider where we're at now, when I look at how much we've unwittingly depleted our planetary boundaries and how little we're having this planetary boundary conversation at the same time we're having the greenhouse gas conversation.
Curious to know, show of hands, who's seen this stuff before?
Things I don't like that before.
Yeah.
Interesting because each of these talks to different parts of the broad planetary system. Each of them is declining at their own rate. The rate of decline is non-linear, and these systems are interdependent. So potential for really quite unpredictable tipping points to be reached is very real. Scale on 4%. It's just severity. They're really stars.
I think it's the number of Earth cycles. So one, and the reason why the red ring is around the one is that represents one Earth. So if we stay within a one, that means we're using sustainably the Earth's resources. Over one, then we're using 2 planets worth or up to 4 planets worth of resources. So we're way out of kilter.
I think the best communicator I've ever seen about this in layman's language is David Attenborough. So last year I got my skates on and I did the University of Cambridge Climate Change and Business Net Zero Transition Program, which is like an MBA unit. It's 9 weeks, about 20 hours a week. It's the best $5,000 I've ever spent in my whole life. And it got me a bit closer to the work of Nick Stern, who was already on my radar from many years ago. And I have to say that the influence of Nick Stern and the UK Treasury Brains Trust on the net zero transition has been outstanding. And if you're into economics, I'd encourage you to read anything that they write. And they also inform the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, and all the thought leadership that comes out of that club, and that club influences the regulators and central banks around the world. The dual COP, so everyone here knows about Glasgow last year, but we may not have clocked Kunming, and the biodiversity COP is being held in three meetings, and the next one is in China in Kunming in May. And it's the biodiversity COP that's influencing the formation of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. And the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is already being rolled out through the international financial system, and people are getting the hang of it, which means the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, is going to be rolled out even quicker. And that's a great thing, but it's also a really challenging thing because we still don't know how to bring carbon and natural capital, biodiversity, onto the balance sheets of agricultural businesses. So I'm deep down in the trenches in my day job trying to contribute to that. I think you would have all seen the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not just pretty icons on a piece of paper, they're real. And if you haven't clocked the state government's ESG inaugural scorecard, which WA Treasury Corp released last November, you might like to have a look at that. It's the first scorecard for the SDGs for Western Australia. Maybe that could be an action, Max, and you could have a chat about what you think of that scorecard. I would say on that scorecard, life on land, we do not rate well in the Southwest Land Division of Western Australia. We've got less than 10% biodiversity left. It's overcleared. And it also has a lot of problems, erosion, soil acidification, a lot of issues. And the farmers are probably there, if they're still from a family farm, It was probably their grandparents who were encouraged to clear the land straight after the Second World War, not knowing what the cumulative impact of that would be now. But now we've got about 3,700 broadacre farmers in Western Australia, and they are whippet smart, scientific, data-driven decision makers, masters of risk management. I couldn't do it. They play Russian roulette with millions of dollars every season, and they are working flat out to ameliorate the soil. But I think that probably the realisation of the magnitude of the biodiversity loss is still not fully appreciated, and that translates into the discussion about deforestation. And back to our Paris goals here. The one that's really important to me is this one. So this is from the IPCC last September, the AR6 climate modelling, physical science model. That is the Paris-aligned trajectory that we should all be aiming for. So 1.9, and tuck that away, it's important. I've spoken about the TCFD and great graphs before, Max, but halving emissions is our task in the next 8 years. That means halving them at our household level, in our workplace, especially at our state level. Not just at an Australian level, but at a state level. And because we're such a resource-dependent state economy, halving emissions in the next 8 years is an almighty challenge, an absolute almighty challenge. And so we all have to work to bring up the climate risk literacy to have this discussion about how are all the sectors going to lean in and work with the state government to create an ambition loop with public sector policy and the private sector action to halve emissions. If we don't halve emissions, if we don't aim for halving, we're falling short. I'll skip over this because Max showed it probably in a better graph than me, but you can see agriculture is there about 13%. Oh, but the thing to notice is the agriculture is a source of emissions, but it's also a sink because agriculture has land. Land can sequester carbon from trees or soil methodologies. So ag is a source and a sink. It's actually farms are a natural kind of circular economic unit in their own right. You probably all know, Max alluded to it, the greening of the ASX, which is fantastic. These are not just greenwashing commitments, but they are, you know, the banks are leading the way because they bear the risk. But it is important to note that Coles and Woolies and the Australian Food and Grocery Network are all making commitments. And so the food supply chain has started to shift. And that's where every one of us in the room can signal by the food purchasing decisions we make. So in Western Australia, how does ag fit into the emissions scene? Well, this is what drives our state economy the most. So that's the resources and energy sector. And then you can see agriculture here. So we're dwarfed in terms of our emissions. We bring about roughly 11 billion to the state every year. We're very efficient, we're industrial, we're export focused, but in the last 10 years, there's been a wonderful shift towards more local processing of food, and people have become much more conscious and connected to how to buy locally, which is wonderful. I don't know if you've noticed the Buy West, Eat Best brand on food in the supermarket. It's good to look for it. Try and shop at the farmers markets and give local producers a go. Sometimes it takes more effort to do that, but it's certainly worth it. But we're producing this food in a rapidly drying, warming climate, which is keeps me awake at night. What's happening is in the north of Western Australia, it's actually getting wetter, but in the Southwest Land Division, it's getting drier, and so the rainfall shadow has moved that much since the 1970s, and we've lost about 20% of our rainfall since the 1970s, and we're projected to lose between 12 and 16% more in the next 20 years. And so our agricultural producers have become incredibly adaptive and efficient and have produced more grain and more meat. But we're under a lot of strain. We're under a lot of strain. And this week, actually, I was watching the grain industry go through its annual research conference, and it is all about crop physiology and strategies that growers can use to plant earlier or manage what we call a hot dry finish, where the grain gets stressed. So the amount of innovation and adaptation that's going into producing food in WA is outstanding. You might not see it, but it's world class. It's just that under a rapidly drying, warming climate, the pressure is just amping up. And it's difficult to see that when we just produced the biggest crop ever, 24 million tonnes. But ironically, we produced that because two tropical storms collided in the first week of April last year and formed one called Saroja. Came down further south than it normally does, dumped a big lot of water over the Southwest Land Division. The growers jumped onto that. They like a good, subsoil moisture profile to start the season. And off we go, 24 million tonne crop. In fact, it's so big that we're having trouble shipping it out. We've got it in, but it's a challenge to actually ship it all out over the next few months. So I bring your attention to the state government's climate projections that were released 2 weeks ago. And I've been making some inquiries about these projections. So I'd like you to appreciate that this is old modelling. It's AR5 modelling from 2014. And so it doesn't have the Paris-aligned 1.5 scenario on it. So if you're having discussions with anyone, please note that there's actually in the published projections so far from the state government, because I know that they are investing in more modelling capacity. So far, there's no 1.9 piece in there. And what you would expect, if there was a 1.9, is another box here, which says something like 50% chance of emissions reaching 1.5 degrees by 2050, net zero by 2050, but it's not there yet. So in a drying, warming climate, bringing carbon and biodiversity onto our balance sheets, this is called natural capital, and natural capital will become for us, it'll become a household tag as the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, gets rolled out later this year. The beta version's coming out at the end of May. So when we go shopping and we're shopping for the household, I think probably most of you might appreciate that, as I explained before, red meat has the largest emissions intensity from the methane enteric emissions in ruminants' stomachs. So that's beef and lamb. Pigs and chooks are monogastric, so they don't make that gas. And then obviously you've got your plant choices further down. And so this is why there is a global movement towards including more plant-based food in diets, because there's this realisation that, the red meat almost becomes, in our household anyway, it's become a sometimes food and more of a luxury than a staple. So a point to remember about the scopes of emissions in food. So between 75% and 90% of greenhouse gases in a food item at the point of sale, point of purchase, comes from upstream scope 3. So up through the processing, supply chain, packaging, but particularly inside the farm gate. And that means that over the next couple of years, we're going to see an intense focus on emissions in agriculture. And I can tell you that our sector is working flat out to wrap our head around this, because we've never had to measure greenhouse gases in farm businesses before. So not only is the sector trying to understand the carbon sequestration opportunities, carbon farming, we're also trying to measure our baseline emissions. I've talked about the major retailers, Coles and Woolies. This is not just cute logos and so the low-hanging fruit, obviously, for the retailers is their electricity consumption. But by 2025, they would have nailed that, and they'll be focusing. Actually, Woolies 2 weeks ago came out with a commitment to reduce Scope 3 by 19% by 2030, I think. So that is really, that's when Woolies and Coles will turn around to their food suppliers and say, what are you doing to make my offer greener? And that's really quite a potential point of conflict there, because if the food suppliers aren't ahead of the game on their emissions, then they're going to get a lot of pressure from the retailers. So I would argue, I don't know if you guys saw the article in the Weekend West just last weekend, but I concur with Janine. I think it's time to have a rethink about food security in Western Australia. And I would argue that there's no more business as usual for any of us, none. So VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And I think that's the world we're living in for the foreseeable future. And so a just transition we now have to think about this commitment to decarbonise Western Australia, make sure everyone's got enough food and it's nutritious, and continue to be one of the world's best producers and exporters of food. And I think that might be over to Dave any second.
Is that why we're making the noise? It's all in the same slide, isn't it?
No, just what's the next one? Just a little bit about our trading partners, because this is one of our assets. We have deep trusted relationships with most of our trading partners. And you might not realise, but we are a partner like this with the Japanese in food security, where they're sole supplier of noodle wheat, food on noodle wheat. We partner with Vietnam. Indonesia is our longest partner in the wheat sector. The Indonesians started buying from us in 1973. And so we've got a lot going for us in those trade relationships. You hear a lot about one particular relationship, which is negative, but it's balanced by a lot of good stuff that you don't hear a lot about. But almost universally, our trading partners have more ambitious 2030 emissions reduction targets than us. So we are regarded as the laggard on environment, the laggard on climate action, and Western Australia, unfortunately, is behind the eastern states. Just keep going. So we're playing catch up. And one of the jobs at hand is for all of us to lean in and work out, what does a carbon budget look like for Western Australia? And this was prepared pre-COVID by a highly regarded global scientist originally from WA, who's come back to WA. His name's Bill Hare. I would describe Bill as an activist scientist. He's extremely well informed. Spent his career working in this space. He's an advisor to governments, small island state governments, and I think if we were going to describe where the potential friction might come as we work through to this point, and I hope we reach this point within the next 12 months, because the state government is looking to set a 2030 target, but potentially there might be some friction between here and here, because the resources and energy sector are looking for offsets from carbon farming. And the agricultural sector is trying to work out, should I enter into carbon farming agreements, or should I use those credits and retain them inside my business? And so everyone is moving rapidly in their own sectors, but we haven't quite got to the point where we can comfortably interact between sectors towards this emissions reduction target. So we've got work to do. think we'll skip the next one. Yeah, I think you guys know about this. Australia has fantastic architecture, climate architecture. You know, we've got good not necessarily the targets, but we have some great policies and federal regulation. So we've got more to work with than we think at the federal level. We'll have a fully functioning carbon market, hopefully within 2.5 years, the Australian Carbon Exchange, where our credits and our biodiversity credits as well will be tradable. That relates back to Article 6 of the Paris Climate Agreement, which was nailed at Glasgow. Keep going. And that's me done. So happy to take any questions or save it to the end. And now I'm passing over to someone much wiser than me.
Thank you, Larissa. Yeah, give it a quick go to see if it's test drive. Okay. Yeah.
It's not it. Oh, there you go. Greetings. Larissa's definitely underselling herself. It's a case of the student has excelled the teacher. I get to tell you about what Austral Fisheries has done in the context mainly around decarbonisation. We do a lot of other stuff, but y'all here are only interested in GHG, so that's what I'm here to give you. The important bits to understand about our business is we're not big, we're not small, circa 120 million, Perth-based, operating in 3 different fisheries. So in the sub-Antarctic, we've got 3 boats running around there chasing Patagonian toothfish in the wintertime. I cut my teeth in a prawn fishery, which is based in Cairns, operates through in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and we're growing a presence in the Darwin-based demersal, that is a snapper fishery. Currently, that is working now. Business is private, vertically integrated. We catch and sell what we catch. So we've got the luxury of taking it from the ocean right through to the consumer. We have a shareholder that includes the world's largest seafood company, and that's a Japanese business called Maruha Nichiro, who have revenues in the order of $9 billion US. So they're really, they've been amazing partners. We're using about 9 million litres of fuel. So our emissions account is just north of 40,000 tonnes a year. And that's all we need to know there. In 2016, after we'd done a whole bunch of other stuff around sustainability, we jumped in, felt that we were looking for the next thing in being a leader in this particular space. We committed to the Climate Active Standard. It was then known as the National Carbon Offset Standard. There were some reasons around that because we wanted to embarrass some members of the government, but that didn't work too well. So we've been doing that for a few years now. Most of the offsets have come from a project that looks to essentially revegetate or indeed re-establish ecosystems at scale in the Eastern Wheat Belt. And I personally just love visiting this place to see the transformation of hard red dirt into canopies of trees and leaf litter and critters and birds. That's really good. If you like, Larissa touched on the nature-based or the biodiversity elements. So there's carbon and then there's nature, but we buy the carbon in this project and they chuck in the steak knives, which is the natural capital advantages. This is not a charity. We're a for-profit business. I have the firm belief that businesses that don't have a narrative that's relevant to communities and the environment really have no future. And so we attempt to build all of those elements into some premium provenance brands. The Glacier 51 is perhaps most famous, but we've been on this journey for 5-7 years now. We do enjoy the sorts of premiums that we would hope. So that's become quite iconic in our little world. And it does allow us to talk to the provenance of the product. And
And brands are one of those things where they kind of encapsulate. There's a whole bunch of intangibles around brands, and it's like building a brand is going up the stairs. Losing it if you do something wrong is like going down the elevator. So you've got to be really careful with how you support those brands. And if you're a commodities producer, which is where we came from, and you put your head up and things go wrong, then you're most vulnerable where the brands hit the road. So I think I am confident that the investment we make in offsets has been useful, but offsets can only get us so far. And if we're not in a position where we are looking to phase out the use of fossil fuels, then we're just pretending. Somebody unkindly suggested that buying offsets was like buying flowers for your wife after you've cheated on her, but I don't quite agree with that. But we've also gone in and recently and spent $50 million on this baby. It's not the answer. It's the fishing boat equivalent of a Prius. So it's got still requires diesel engines. It's got some very clever powertrain and optimization arrangements, load shaving battery, 350 kilowatt hours, and some pretty clever design work. I do want more out of all of that, and we have a nice little project where we're working with Adrian and some of the clever people at Austral Ships, and looking at what alternate fuels would be available, primarily for our snapper fleet, where the emissions intensity is a bit lower. This last bit really gets me almost to the end of what I have to say, but I think the future is definitely around embracing these changes. It's important that business leaders, I think, do become fluent in the language of climate and climate policy. I'm absolutely certain that without a proper narrative on this, then it will become increasingly difficult to attract capital and talent. And particularly talent in this particular market becomes super critical. And frankly, without capital and talent, you might as well turn the lights out. There can be no future. It's doing that again, Max. There you go. No, you're not helping. Good thing we're nearly done. So the brief was to give you a quick feel on the food business. Larissa's thoughtfully put down some of the areas that can make a difference. And the objective has to be around, I think, what can we each do individually to halve our own personal emissions by the end of the decade. And there's plenty can be done.
Stay on time. Thank you.